My mother, a 72-year-old retired librarian, was just arrested for assaulting a police officer with a gardening trowel. The problem? I run the FBI, and this small-town arrest might just unravel an international criminal syndicate. The call came in on a line that was supposed to be reserved for matters of national security. I was in the middle of a briefing on a foreign cyber threat, the kind of meeting where every word is classified and could shift global politics. My phone, a specially encrypted device that sat silently on the polished mahogany table, vibrated with a low, insistent hum. It wasn't my work line. It was my personal number, and only 3 people had it. My heart lurched. My assistant, a stoic woman named Harris, shot me a look of concern. I held up a hand, silencing the intelligence analyst mid-sentence, and answered the call. It was my mother's neighbor, Helen Gable. She was hysterical. "Alex, thank God. They took her. They put her in the car and just took her." My blood ran cold. The meticulously constructed world of threat assessments and counter-terrorism operations dissolved into a single, terrifying thought. "Mom, Helen, slow down. Who took who? What are you talking about?" "The police, Alex. They arrested your mother. Something about Mr. Henderson's fence and her prize-winning roses. She wouldn't let them touch them and... Oh, it was awful. They put her in handcuffs." Handcuffs. My mother, Eleanor, a 72-year-old woman whose greatest crime was overwatering her petunias, in handcuffs. The air left my lungs. The room of high-ranking officials stared at me, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the floor. "Harris, clear my schedule for the rest of the day. Get the jet ready. Destination, Northwood." Harris didn't question it. She just nodded, already tapping on her tablet. I turned to the room. "Gentlemen, a family emergency. You're dismissed. The 2-hour flight was the longest of my life. Northwood was the small, sleepy town I'd grown up in, a place I'd left behind for a world of concrete and shadows in Washington, D.C. It was a town where the biggest news was usually a bake sale at the local church. The idea of my mother being arrested there was so absurd it felt like a dream. She was a retired librarian. Her hands, now supposedly bound in steel, had spent 40 years gently guiding children toward the magic of books. I landed at the small municipal airport and got into the black, unassuming sedan that was waiting for me. I didn't use a motorcade or sirens. I wanted to handle this quietly, as a son, not as who I was. I drove straight to the Northwood Police Department, a squat brick building that hadn't changed since I was a kid. It smelled the same too, a mix of stale coffee, cheap disinfectant, and a faint, underlying scent of desperation. The man at the front desk was a portly sergeant with a mustache that looked like a tired caterpillar. He was reading a fishing magazine and didn't bother to look up when I approached. "Can I help you?" he grunted. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice even. "I'm here about Eleanor Vance. I was told she was brought in this morning." He finally looked up, his eyes lazy and unimpressed. Vance. Oh yeah, the garden gnome terrorist." He chuckled to himself. "Assaulting an officer. She's in processing." My jaw tightened so hard I felt a muscle jump. Assaulting an officer? My mother is 72 years old and weighs 110 pounds soaking wet. "Tell that to Officer Miller's shin. She took a gardening trowel to it," he said with a smirk. "She's a feisty one." Another officer, younger and with the unmistakable swagger of someone who peaked in high school, swaggered out from a back room. This had to be Miller. He had a smug look on his face that I instantly wanted to wipe off. "You the son?" he asked, hooking his thumbs into his duty belt. "Your mom's got a real temper on her. We got a complaint from her neighbor Henderson. Said she was trespassing and destroying his new fence. When I tried to intervene, she got violent. Had no choice but to bring her in." I stared at him, my training kicking in, analyzing his body language, the slight exaggeration in his posture, the lie swimming in his eyes. "She got violent," I repeated, my voice dangerously soft. "Officer, my mother has arthritis so bad she can barely open a jar of pickles. You're telling me this woman, who has never so much as received a parking ticket, assaulted a trained police officer with a gardening tool?" Sergeant Mustache shrugged. "That's what the report says. Look, she'll be able to post bail in a few hours once we get her prints and picture. Procedure." "I want to see her," I said. It wasn't a request. Not possible, Miller cut in. She's in a holding cell. No visitors until she's processed. She's a 72-year-old woman accused of arguing over a rose bush, I said, my patience fraying into a thin, sharp wire. You have her in a holding cell? Look, buddy, the sergeant said, leaning forward on his elbows, his tone dripping with condescension. I don't know who you think you are, waltzing in here from the big city in your fancy suit, but this is my station. We do things by the book. Your mother committed a crime, and now she has to face the consequences. You can wait here like everyone else. He dismissed me with a wave of his hand and went back to his magazine. Miller grinned, clearly enjoying the show. They had no idea. They saw a man in a suit, a worried son, someone they could bully and dismiss. They had no concept of the storm they had just unleashed. I had tried to do this as Alex Vance, the son, but they weren't interested in listening to him. Fine, they would listen to someone else. I took a slow, deliberate breath. The part of me that was just a son receded, and the part that had dismantled international criminal organizations took its place. I looked Sergeant Davis dead in the eye, my voice dropping to a calm, flat tone he'd never heard before. Sergeant, I will have your name and badge number, and Officer Miller's. I also require the name and contact information for the on-call county prosecutor. Now. Sergeant Davis actually laughed. It was a short, wheezing sound that shook his belly. You want my badge number? You want the prosecutor's number? Who do you think you are, the president? He leaned back in his squeaky chair, crossing his arms over his chest. My badge number is 422. His is 714, he said, gesturing with his chin at Miller. And the prosecutor is busy. You can call his office during business hours tomorrow and leave a message. Now, I'd advise you to take a seat and wait quietly, Mr. You never did give us your name. Miller stepped forward, his hand resting near his sidearm in a practiced, intimidating gesture. We could charge you with interfering with an investigation, pal. I suggest you listen to the sergeant. I didn't look at Miller. I kept my eyes locked on Davis. I could see the tiny beads of sweat on his forehead under the harsh fluorescent lights. He was a small man, playing a king in a kingdom of beige linoleum, and he wasn't used to being challenged. I reached into my jacket, and for a split second, Miller tensed up, his hand twitching. I slowly pulled out my phone. My name is Alex Vance, I said quietly, scrolling through my contacts. And you're right, the county prosecutor is probably busy. I'll try someone else. I found the number I was looking for and pressed the call button. It rang once before it was answered. The two officers watched me, their amusement curdling into suspicion. John, it's Alex. I apologize for calling you on your personal line, I said into the phone. The atmosphere in the room shifted. My tone wasn't that of a frantic son anymore. It was level, professional, the one I used when I was giving orders. I have a situation here. Northwood Police Department. It involves an unlawful detention of a U.S. citizen, a 72-year-old woman, based on what appears to be a fabricated charge of assaulting an officer. Sergeant Davis's face went from smug to stony. Miller's grin had completely vanished, replaced by a deep frown. The arresting officer is a badge number 714, Officer Miller, I continued, my eyes flicking over to him. He flinched, almost imperceptibly. The supervising officer is Sergeant Davis, badge 422. Yes, I have reason to believe this is a gross overreach of authority, potentially motivated by personal bias. The neighbor who filed the initial complaint is a Mr. Henderson. I'd like a full review of all recent interactions between the department and Mr. Henderson. Check for a pattern. I listened for a moment. Yes, John. I believe a full investigation into this precinct's procedures and potential civil rights violations is warranted. Start with these two. I want their service jackets, complaint histories, everything. And I want my mother, Eleanor Vance, released within the next 5 minutes. No bail, no processing. All charges dropped and the arrest expunged. If she is not walking out of that door, unharmed, in 5 minutes, you and I will be having a very different conversation. Thank you, John. I hung up and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The silence in the station was absolute. It was so quiet I could hear the buzz of the overhead lights. Davis and Miller just stared at me. Their bravado was a cheap suit, and the seams were starting to split. "Who was that?" Davis asked, his voice now a low, uncertain rumble. "That was a colleague," I said simply. "You can't just call someone and demand—" Miller started, but his voice trailed off. He knew. They both knew. The sheer, unadulterated authority in my voice had been unmistakable. They didn't know who I was, but they knew I was someone far above their pay grade. For about a minute, nothing happened. The two officers exchanged nervous glances. Davis picked up a pen and put it down again. Miller shifted his weight from foot to foot. They were caught in a trap of their own making, a limbo between their ingrained arrogance and a dawning, terrifying realization that they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. I stood perfectly still, watching them, letting the silence do its work. Then, the phone on Sergeant Davis's desk shrieked. It was a shrill, piercing sound that made both officers jump. Davis stared at it like it was a venomous snake. On the third ring, he snatched it up, his hand trembling slightly. "Northwood PD, Sergeant Davis speaking," he said, trying to inject his old authority into his voice, but it came out as a squeak. I watched his face. It was a fascinating, rapid-fire display of emotion. Confusion, then disbelief, then pure, abject terror. His skin, already ruddy, turned a pasty white. His eyes widened, fixed on me, as he listened to the voice on the other end of the line. He started sweating profusely, droplets running down his temples. "Yes, Chief. Yes, sir. I understand. But he—" "Yes, sir. Immediately, sir." He slammed the phone down, his whole body shaking. He looked at Officer Miller, his expression one of utter panic. "Get her," he croaked. "Get her now. Uncuff her. Get her a bottle of water. Apologize to her." Miller, looking like he'd seen a ghost, practically sprinted towards the back rooms. Davis turned to me, his professional mask completely shattered. He looked like a child who had just been caught setting fire to the principal's office. "Sir," he stammered, his eyes wide with a fear I had seen many times before, usually in the faces of men who were about to lose everything. "The chief is on his way down. The state police are being notified. The U.S. Attorney's office just called the chief's cell. Sir, please, who are you?" I looked at the crumbling facade of Sergeant Davis, at the raw fear that had replaced the cheap arrogance. Part of me, the part that was a son, felt a grim satisfaction. The other part, the professional, felt a familiar weariness. Power, in the wrong hands, always rotted from the inside out. These men weren't just incompetent. They were bullies who had finally picked a fight with someone they couldn't intimidate. "Who I am isn't important right now, Sergeant," I said, my voice cold and devoid of any emotion. "What's important is that my mother walks out that door, and she is treated with the respect she deserves. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." "Absolutely, sir," he sputtered, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He looked like he was about to be physically ill. He fumbled with some papers on his desk, his hands shaking too badly to hold them steady. He was a drowning man, and the water was rising fast. A moment later, Officer Miller reappeared, practically escorting my mother by the elbow as if she were a visiting dignitary. My mother, Eleanor Vance, stood there, looking small and tired, but her back was ramrod straight. The librarian in her would never slouch, not even after being held in a concrete cell. Her silver hair was slightly disheveled, and there was a smudge of dirt on her cheek, but her eyes, her sharp, intelligent eyes, flashed with indignation. She was holding a plastic bottle of water. When she saw me, a wave of relief washed over her face, softening the hard lines of her anger. "Alex," she said, her voice a little shaky. "I told them you'd come." I crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into a hug. I could feel the frailness of her bones, the slight tremor in her hands. A rage, cold and pure, settled deep in my gut. They had put their hands on my mother. They had made her feel afraid. "Are you all right, Mom?" I asked, my voice low and for her ears only. "I'm fine," she whispered back, patting my arm. "Just furious. That horrid man, Henderson, he tore out my prize-winning Charlotte Armstrongs, said they were creeping under his new fence. When I tried to replant them, he called the police. This brute," she gestured vaguely towards Miller, who visibly winced. accused me of attacking him when I wouldn't let him trample the rest of my garden. I pulled back and looked her over. There were faint red marks on her delicate wrists where the handcuffs had been. The rage inside me burned hotter. I turned my head and gave Miller a look that promised a future of endless bureaucratic misery. He couldn't meet my gaze. His eyes were glued to the scuffed linoleum floor. "Sergeant," I said, turning back to Davis. "I trust the charges have been dropped." "Dropped, expunged, it's like it never happened, sir," Davis said, nodding his head so vigorously I thought it might fall off. "A complete misunderstanding. A clerical error." "It was no clerical error," my mother chimed in, her voice ringing with clarity. "It was malice and incompetence. This town used to have standards." Just then, the main doors of the station burst open. A man in a police chief's uniform, looking harried and panicked, strode in. He was older, with a graying crew cut, and a face that was already flushed with stress. His eyes scanned the room and locked onto me. He ignored his own officers completely. "Mr. Vance?" he asked, his voice strained. He was practically vibrating with anxiety. "I am," I confirmed. "Chief Bill Roberts," he said, extending a hand, which I didn't take. "Sir, on behalf of the Northwood Police Department, I want to offer my deepest, most sincere apologies to you and your mother. What happened here today is inexcusable. It is not representative of our department. I can assure you, a full internal investigation is already underway. The officers involved have been placed on immediate administrative leave." Davis and Miller looked like they'd been shot. Their faces went slack with shock. "Chief, you can't," Davis started. "Shut your mouth, Carl," Roberts snapped without even looking at him. His focus was entirely on me. "Sir, is there anything at all we can do? Any accommodation we can make? You can start by explaining to me how a dispute over a rosebush escalates to a 72-year-old woman being arrested for assault," I said, my voice lethally calm. "There's no excuse, sir." "None," the chief said, sweating under his collar. "Officer Miller's judgment was poor. Sergeant Davis's supervision was lacking. The situation was mishandled from the very beginning. My mother, never one to be a silent victim, spoke up." "Poor judgment?" "Chief Roberts, I've known you since you were a boy stealing apples from Mrs. Gable's tree. That young man lied. He claimed I attacked him to justify his own aggression. And that man Henderson has been bullying me for months. This department has ignored every complaint I've made about him." Chief Roberts's face paled even further. He knew this was spiraling far beyond two rogue cops. This was about a systemic failure. "I'm taking my mother home," I said, turning to leave. "You and I will talk later, Chief. I expect a full report on my desk by morning. Everything. The initial call, body cam footage, all of it. And my office will be in touch regarding the formal investigation." "Your office, sir?" the chief asked, his voice barely a whisper. I paused at the door, turning back to face the three of them, the terrified chief, the disgraced sergeant, and the shell-shocked rookie. They had pushed and bullied and abused their power, and now the bill had come due. They still didn't know who I was, only that I was someone with a long reach and a cold fury. Let them wonder. Let them sweat. The truth would be far worse than anything they could imagine. As I guided my mother out into the fresh air, my personal phone rang again. It was Harris. Her voice was urgent. "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you, but something's happened," she said. "We've been monitoring the Northwood PD's internal comms as you requested. The arresting officer, Miller? He just made a call from his personal cell. It wasn't to his wife or his lawyer." "Who did he call, Harris?" I asked, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. "He called a burner phone, sir, a number we've been trying to trace for 6 months. It's a number connected to the syndicate, the same people we're investigating for the port smuggling ring in Baltimore." The world tilted on its axis. For a moment I couldn't breathe. The syndicate. Here, in Northwood. The sleepy, insignificant town of my childhood was suddenly the epicenter of a major federal investigation. The random, thuggish incompetence of Officer Miller and Sergeant Davis was no longer random at all. It was a symptom of a much deeper sickness. They hadn't just arrested my mother. They had stumbled onto a tripwire they didn't even know existed. And in doing so, they dragged my personal and professional lives into a terrifying collision. Are you sure, Harris? I asked, my voice dangerously low, as I helped my mother into the passenger seat of my car. She looked at me with concern, sensing the immediate shift in my demeanor. 100%, sir, Harris confirmed. We got a partial voice match on the other end. It's him. It's the broker. Miller told him a DC suit was asking questions about his mother's arrest. The broker told him to lay low and that he'd handle it. Handle it. Chills ran down my spine. The broker was a ghost, a high-level facilitator for the syndicate who arranged logistics, payoffs, and, when necessary, disappearances. We'd been hunting him for nearly a year, and he had a dirty cop on his payroll in the one town on Earth where he could get to my mother. This wasn't just about a fence and some roses anymore. They had targeted her, or at the very least they had used the situation to their advantage, never knowing their small-town pawn had just arrested the mother of the man hunting their entire organization. "Get a team here," I said into the phone, my voice like ice. "Plainclothes, tax support, full surveillance on Miller, Davis, and this neighbor, Henderson. I want to know who he is, what his connection is, and get a protective detail to my mother's house. Now, Harris, I don't care what you have to pull them from." "Already on its way, sir. ETA is 20 minutes. I hung up and got into the driver's seat. My mother was looking at me, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Alex, what is it? That wasn't about the police, was it?" I took a deep breath. My first instinct was to protect her, to lie, to tell her it was just work. But my mother was smarter than that. She deserved the truth. "No, Mom, it wasn't. It seems those officers are involved in something much bigger. And it seems you, entirely by accident, just helped us find a piece of the puzzle we've been missing for a very long time." When we arrived at her small, charming house, 2 black SUVs were already parked discreetly down the street. A man in a simple polo shirt and slacks, indistinguishable from any other suburban dad, but with the coiled readiness of a trained agent, met us at the curb. "Mr. Vance, Agent Coulson, we have the perimeter secured. Your mother will be safe here." I spent the next hour with my mother, making her tea and explaining as much as I could without revealing classified details. I told her that she was the victim of something far more sinister than a neighborhood squabble, and that her standing up for herself had inadvertently exposed it. She listened, her face grim but resolute. My mother was no wilting flower. She was forged from the same steel that I was. As night fell, the operation moved with silent, breathtaking speed. Under the authority of a federal warrant I secured with a single phone call, teams moved in. They picked up Officer Miller as he was trying to burn documents in a barbecue pit in his backyard. They arrested Sergeant Davis at a local bar, where he was drunkenly telling anyone who would listen that some government spook had ruined his life. They brought in the neighbor, Henderson, a man who crumbled under questioning in less than 10 minutes. The picture that emerged was sickeningly clear. Henderson wasn't just a grumpy neighbor. He was a low-level lookout for the syndicate. The port in Baltimore was getting too much heat, so they were scouting smaller regional airports like the one in Northwood to move their illicit goods. Henderson's job was to keep an eye on things, and he paid off local cops like Miller and Davis to look the other way and handle any local nuisances. My mother, with her librarian's penchant for observation and her refusal to be intimidated, had become a nuisance. Henderson complained, and Miller, eager to flex his paid-for authority, decided to make an example of her. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The final piece of the puzzle was the broker. Using the intel from Miller's panicked call, our cyber forensics team triangulated his position. He wasn't in some high-tech lair in a major city. He was hiding in plain sight, running a small accounting firm 2 towns over from Northwood. I didn't lead the raid myself. My place was no longer in the field, but I watched it all unfold from a mobile command unit we set up near my mother's house. I watched on a monitor as a team of highly trained agents breached the office and apprehended a bewildered-looking man in a cheap suit. The ghost we had been chasing for a year. His career of crime ended because he employed a thug who picked a fight with the wrong 72-year-old woman over her rose bushes. By sunrise, it was over. The local syndicate cell was dismantled. Miller, Davis, and Henderson were in federal custody, their petty corruption exposed as a gateway to a much larger evil. Their careers weren't just over, their lives as they knew them were. They were facing a laundry list of federal charges that would put them away for decades. Chief Roberts willingly handed over his entire department's files for federal oversight, his career saved only by his swift and total cooperation. I walked out into my mother's garden as the sun came up. She was already there, wearing her gardening gloves, gently tending to the roses that had started it all. The protective detail was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of a normal morning. "Are they all gone?" she asked, not looking up from a particularly beautiful Charlotte Armstrong bloom. "They're all gone, Mom," I said. "It's over." She finally looked up at me, a small, proud smile on her face. "Good," she said simply. "Nobody messes with my roses." I looked at this incredible woman who had faced down bullies her whole life, whether they were on the playground or in a police uniform. In that moment, I wasn't the director of the FBI. I wasn't the man who dismantled criminal empires. I was just Alex Vance, the son of a retired librarian who had, in her own quiet, indomitable way, reminded the entire world that you should never, ever underestimate a woman defending her garden,